There are quite a few authenticated cases of man-made artefacts being found in rocks which are thought to be very old, especially coal seams, for example. It's quite commonplace. What tends to happen is that conventional geologists take these artefacts and dismiss them immediately. They say they must be wrong, they couldn't possibly be of that age. Well, I suppose there are two explanations for these artefacts. The first is that there really were people making things many, many millions of years ago, or alternatively, our dating methods are not as reliable as we think they are, and the strata are much younger. I think on the whole, the second explanation is probably the more sensible one. Science says that strata can be dated by radioactive dating techniques, and there's a whole range of techniques that are used in the laboratory to date rocks with what appear to be great accuracy. Now, in reality, when you start to examine these radioactive methods of dating, you find that they're a lot less reliable than they at first seem, and there are many, many examples of that. But it may well be the case that a human artifact, which is found in a rock seam which appears to be millions of years old, if that rock seam has been dated by radioactive techniques, it may well be that it's much less old than is thought. On the face of it, an artifact, human artifact found in a layer of rock which seems to be millions of years old is an inexplicable anomaly. It's not so inexplicable if the strata isn't millions of years old and if the dating method that's being used is in fact inaccurate. And I suspect that in many cases that's exactly what has happened in recent years. We use radioactive dating techniques to date rock strata. The technique is thought to be unassailably reliable. It's thought to be absolutely accurate. In fact, many, many anomalies have been discovered which do cast doubt on the accuracy of the method, and many scientists who are involved in dating and in metallurgy and chemistry and other related fields have published papers casting doubt on the accuracy of radioactive dating. But these doubts tend to be ignored by the scientific community. The dating anomalies and the evidence which contradicts the reliability of dating is being ignored by scientists on the whole, because they'd have to restructure their whole theory of the age of the Earth. It would mean really starting from scratch. There are some, for example, artifacts found in coal seams appear to suggest that there were humans around hundreds of millions of years ago. That would be impossible by current theory. Alternatively, the coal seam might actually be very recent. The coal might have been formed a million years or even less than a million years ago. That too would be unacceptable to modern science. For example, the rate at which coal is formed is still controversial. The conventional idea is that coal is formed very slowly over millions of years, and that basically it's age that determines the formation of coal. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence in the field that coal might be produced from wood by pressure alone. For example, modern timber pilings of bridges have turned into a low rank of coal. The Ohio coal seam in the United States, the rank of the coal increases as the coal goes further and further underground, as the pressure increases. So it seems there is some evidence that pressure alone might generate coal in a relatively short space of time. Now, if coal can be produced relatively rapidly, what about the other rocks of the Earth's crust? Perhaps they could be formed relatively rapidly as well. This is complete heresy. This is one thing that orthodox geologists would not accept, and yet there is mounting evidence that some types of rock can be formed very quickly in catastrophic conditions. The effect that this has on our picture of the age of the Earth is that the Earth could conceivably be younger than the 4.5 billion years that it's customarily taken to be. And if that's the case, then there has been much less time available for life to evolve on Earth, and the Darwinian mechanism, which requires billions of years to work, is looking far less probable. There are many methods of dating that have been suggested over the past 50 years or so which don't rely on radioactive techniques, and some of which suggest that the Earth could be younger than we customarily think. For example, meteoric dust comes into the atmosphere every year at quite a substantial rate. Now, if the Earth really were 4,500 million years old, there would be many billions and billions of tons of meteoric dust on the Earth's surface. And the dust, by the way, is very easy to identify because it has 300 times more nickel content than terrestrial dust does. But this dust isn't present. It's been suggested it's been swept into the oceans and incorporated into ocean sediments. But of course, the ocean sediments are available to us in the form of the sedimentary rocks that are exposed all over the Earth's crust, and there's no sign of the meteoric dust there either. So where's it gone? That's at least one measure which suggests the Earth could be younger than it presently is thought. The significance of the great age of the Earth is that Darwinism is essentially a theory that's about time. Darwinism requires billions of years of time, because the way that evolution is envisaged by Darwinists is as a process of gradual change, tiny changes, one generation onto the next, taking place over billions of years. Without those billions of years, the Darwinian process just couldn't take place. Darwin's theory is, I think it's been accepted so well because it's an immensely powerful tool of explanation, and we humans love to have things explained, because that's what science is all about, isn't it? Explaining the world to ourselves. Darwin's theory appears to explain how we got here, how all living things got here, how things change, how we all arose from a common ancestor, how the Earth itself came into being. And it's very satisfying to many people to believe that they have a natural explanation to all those questions. That, I think, has meant that to a large extent people have not questioned the theory quite as thoroughly as they should have done. They have not bothered to deal with the anomalies that have arisen in the evidence. And quite naturally, when anomalous evidence has been discovered, scientists have tended to put it to one side, to think, well, when our overarching theory is extended in future, it will ultimately be able to explain this. The trouble is that the anomalies have been building up. They haven't just been swept under the carpet. There's now a mountain of them, and the mountain is threatening to topple over and swamp the theory completely. The key problems with Darwin's theory are that, quite simply, there isn't any really solid empirical evidence. It's conjecture on conjecture, supposition on supposition. They're all very plausible, they're very rational suppositions, very rational conjectures, but they are still conjectures. And I find it ironic that for most of this century, Darwinists have acted and spoken as if they had already delivered conclusive proof to us of their theory. Well, in fact, that's the last thing they've done. There is no conclusive evidence of Darwinism. The evidence seems solid, but as soon as you start to investigate it, it just melts away. The idea is that the theory is basically in place, that there are just a few gaps, we'll fill those gaps in sooner or later. But when you come to examine the concrete examples that are given, that are taught in schools and colleges, that most people who've been educated in a developed country in recent years have been given and have accepted, you find that they're not quite what they seem. Let me give you a couple of examples. Probably the most famous example is the peppered moth. This is a light-coloured moth which lives in the northern counties of England, and between the years 1850 and 1900, when the trees were darkened by atmospheric pollution from factory chimneys, the moth changed from a light grey colour to a dark grey colour so that it could remain camouflaged on the tree trunks, because the birds eat the moth. Well, this was described, this process, it's even been given a name by Darwinists. It's called industrial melanism, and it was described by the director of the Natural History Museum, Sir Gavin de Beer, as being an example of evolution and even natural selection taking place in man's lifetime. And obviously, if that were true, it would be very powerful evidence. Well, when you look at the peppered moth, you don't need to be a scientist to be able to see that what's happened is that originally you had a lot of light-coloured moths and a few dark-coloured moths, that the light-coloured moths have died off because the trees have turned dark, and that the dark-coloured moths have flourished at their expense. Now, if Darwinists want to call that natural selection, they're entitled to do so. But nobody could possibly believe that that is a mechanism that could explain how one species could turn into another species. And that is what evolution is all about, not about moths changing colour. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming completely aquatic in their way of life, and ending up looking like creatures, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. In other words, a bear, like a polar bear or a grizzly bear, could turn into a whale, or a whale-like creature, given only enough time, given millions of years and natural selection. Bears could become whales. Now, the interesting thing is that in later editions of his book, he removed this claim. He'd obviously thought about it, thought better of it, and realised that it couldn't be substantiated with evidence. Now, it's fine for an author to change his mind. All authors change their mind. But the significance of this is that the idea that a bear could turn into a whale is the central core idea of Darwin's theory. This is the whole of his theory. So when he removed that example, he was removing the very essence of his book, that one species could turn into another species by natural selection given enough time. Now, no Darwinist today would be rash enough to stand up and say that a bear could turn into a whale. But that is what they believe, or at any rate that's what they teach in schools and colleges. And the idea is unsupported by evidence today, just as it was in Darwin's day when he removed the example from his book. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming aquatic, and eventually becoming a creature, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. So there you have the idea, bears can turn into whales just given enough time and enough natural selection. Now, in later editions of his book, Darwin removed that claim. He'd obviously thought better of it and realised it couldn't be substantiated with evidence, so he thought he'd better not press it. But the interesting thing about him removing that is that the idea that a bear can turn into a whale through natural selection is the very core idea of Darwinism. It's the top and bottom of the Darwinian theory, that one species can turn into another species. And in removing that example, I can't help feeling that Darwin must have had grave reservations about the rest of his theory. An interesting question is, how did Darwin approach his own theory? How did he arrive at the theory? How did he publicise it? He was a very, very thorough researcher, and he considered many, many possibilities. He considered some ideas which are anathema to modern Darwinists. For example, he gave credence to the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He wrote about a father who'd lost his fingers in an accident and had a son who also had missing fingers. So he was willing to entertain a range of ideas. But I can't help thinking that if Darwin were alive today and he saw what had been made of his theory, the modern neo-Darwinist theory, I think he would be horrified, because the modern theory is quite antithetical to this openness, to his willingness to consider every aspect of living things. The modern theory is a theory of blind chance and nothing more. On the face of it, Darwinism and creationism are opposite theories. They're diametrically opposed. In a funny kind of way, they actually can go together, because Darwinism itself only explains how one kind of creature turns into another kind of creature. It doesn't explain how life originated. Now, creationism is a theory that does explain how life originated. So I suppose you could say that for a person with religious beliefs, Darwinism and creationism could coexist. Darwinism, strictly speaking, doesn't offer an explanation of how life originated. That's a mystery. It's left unspoken. Darwin himself, in a private letter to a friend, conjectured that maybe there was a warm puddle somewhere on the Earth's surface, and that a few chemicals got together, and that spontaneously the first microorganism came into being. That's been a very popular idea for the last 100 years, but interestingly, no scientist has yet been able to actually synthesize anything from scratch, any kind of living being or any part of any living molecule. Nothing has been synthesized, despite a great deal of optimism on the part of microbiologists. So I think maybe Darwinism, Darwinists are conscious of the fact that there is a rather gaping gap in their theory right at the beginning. Creationists believe that the rocks of the Earth's crust demonstrate that the biblical tale of Genesis is correct, and that there was a global flood, that all the creatures on the Earth were destroyed in that flood, and that the sedimentary rocks and the fossils they contain are the relics of that flood. Now, I suppose you would have to say that, strictly speaking, you could interpret the fossils and the rocks in that way. The problem with the theory, from my point of view, is that there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support that view, just as there isn't any evidence to support the Darwinist view. In fact, in many ways, creationism and Darwinism are mirror images of each other. They are really almost religious beliefs, both of them. How did I come to write The Facts of Life? Well, at first my interest was purely in geology. I wanted to collect rock and fossil specimens. That made me begin to question the evidence that I was seeing in the museum, and I wanted to find out for myself exactly what evidence there was to support Darwinism. Were the things that I'd been told at school and in college, were they really true? My own daughter Julia was just starting school. She was going to be taught the same information. Was it right or was it wrong? Well, I spent 10 years in total looking at that evidence again, and I wasn't able to find any one thing that I could say for sure was true about Darwinism. I was disturbed to think that young people were being taught as fact something which I knew was really pure conjecture. When The Facts of Life was published, I then realised what a can of worms I'd opened up, because I was immediately accused of being a kind of secret creationist, of somebody who had a hidden agenda. It seemed that scientists found it impossible to believe that any rational person could seriously question a theory that they believed in and had believed in all their lives. And I encountered the most intemperate, I was called stupid, loony, that I was told that I was writing drivel. It was suggested I needed psychiatric help. Prominent scientists were wheeled out to barrage me with personal abuse as a way of just doing away with this troublesome journalist. In a way, I almost sympathise with some of my critics, because they found it literally impossible to believe that somebody could seriously question Darwinism. They found it literally impossible. They were locked in so far to that view that they just couldn't interpret the evidence that was in front of them in any other way other than as being Darwinist. And to them, any attempt to criticise Darwinism had to be the work of either a madman or a creationist. There was just no other way. I think they were unable to conceive that there was an alternative theory, because Darwinism has somehow worked itself into the fabric of our whole scientific and educational system. It's almost the backbone, really, of our scientific thinking. In the life sciences, there just is no alternative theory. It underpins everything. I think also there is a sense in which they're afraid to open themselves to new possibilities, just in case that there's one chink in the armour that is going to bring about the unravelling of the whole fabric of science. I think most people educated in a developed country in the last 50 years have been taught that Darwinism is an absolutely solid theory and that it's backed up by evidence both in the laboratory and in the field. And I think most of those people would be surprised to hear that, in fact, the theory is largely conjecture, and what we've been offered as evidence, when you examine it closely, it simply melts away. For example, the kind of evidence that we've been offered regarding the peppered moth, the evolution of horses, Archaeopteryx, that's the animal that's half reptile, half bird. All this physical evidence that we've been offered and which is in the museums to be examined, when you examine it closely, you find it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. An important question which you can ask here is, what exactly constitutes a scientific theory? Now, there's been a lot of argument about this, but certainly there is a definition of a scientific theory, and Darwinism does not meet that criterion at all. Basically, a scientific theory is something which must be capable of being falsified if it's true. But Darwinism can't be falsified. It's an infinitely elastic theory. It just simply gobbles up all and every evidence it's offered and says, oh yes, that proves Darwinism is true. In one sense, you can understand people's reluctance to drop Darwinism, because apart from the fact that it's an attractive theory, there is also a scientific principle. It's called the principle of tenacity, that you shouldn't junk ideas just because a few anomalies have come along. The trouble is that the anomalies with Darwinism are so enormous that they're now greater than the theory itself, and so we should start questioning this principle of tenacity. We should start questioning, should we be hanging on to this theory regardless? Some people have said to me, how can you criticise a theory if you don't have something to replace it with? Well, I don't accept that. If the emperor hasn't got any clothes on, then the emperor hasn't got any clothes on. It's not my fault. A lot of people are rather prone to shoot the messenger because they don't like the message. It seems to me that if Darwinism is wrong, then somebody has got to point the finger. I suppose if you ask me to evaluate Darwinism, I'd say that there is a certain amount of weak circumstantial evidence in favour of natural selection having some influence on evolution. But if you ask me to say, can this account for the origin of species, that's the question that Darwin was trying to answer, I'd have to say, no, it can't account for the origin of species. Natural selection is significant in evolutionary terms in one sense, and that is that it can account for variation within a species. For example, how you can have a light moth and a dark moth, and how one can change into the other. You could also point to the Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, where they say that there are 14 different species, each adapted to a different island. Actually, they're all members of the same species. Is there any evidence that the rocks of the Earth's crust have formed rapidly and all at once rather than slowly over billions of years? Well, yes, there is a certain amount of evidence, and ironically, there's a piece of it standing right outside the Natural History Museum in London. There you'll find there's a fossil tree. It's maybe 30 feet tall. What does this tell us? Well, if a tree is going to be buried and fossilised, in something that's going to become rock, it obviously has to be buried all at once, otherwise the tree will simply rot away. Anybody can see that. This tree, in order to become fossilised, had to be buried in 30, 50, 100 feet of sediment very rapidly. And yet the scientists who work in the Natural History Museum continue to believe that the rocks of the Earth's crust had to be formed very, very slowly over billions of years, just tiny amounts of sediment being deposited each year. There's plenty of other evidence of rocks being formed relatively quickly through apparently some kind of catastrophe. For example, on every continent there are beds full of the bones of millions of animals. And you can contrast this with cases that we know of where millions of animals have been killed but haven't turned into fossils. For instance, on the Great Plains of America there were 60 million buffalo when white settlers arrived. They were all killed in a very short space of time. But there are no buffalo beds forming on the Great Plains. Those animals, after they were killed, they were simply eaten by scavengers. When you look at buildings like London's Natural History Museum, it looks almost like a cathedral or a church, and in a way I suppose it is a kind of cathedral or church, or at least it's a temple to Darwinism. Inside you have all the exhibits that are meant to show that Darwinism is true. I've looked in that museum and many other museums, but I haven't been able to find the evidence that conclusively proves that Darwinism is true. But many people go to worship at that shrine, and many people do believe in Darwinism. I suppose you could call it a kind of religion. People come to museums like the Natural History Museum to have their questions answered. Is man related to the apes? Do man and the ape share a common ancestor? And when you look at the exhibits in the museum, you'd think that the question had been answered decisively, yes, we are related to the apes. What the museum doesn't tell you is that the exhibit is an interpretation of the fossils. It's a point of view, it's a Darwinian interpretation, and you won't find any other interpretation either in the Natural History Museum or any other museum. In one sense, I sympathise with Darwinists because they're simply looking for a rational explanation of the biological facts, and Darwinism is a rational explanation, a reasonable explanation. The trouble is, it simply isn't supported by the evidence. Let me give you one example, the famous Lucy skeleton that was recently found in Africa. The few bones that were discovered have been restored or interpreted as a missing link creature, half human, half ape. But it's important to bear in mind that those bones can be and have been put together in different ways to show different creatures. For example, an extinct ape who's not related to humans at all. The creature that's represented by Lucy, Australopithecus, is in fact the only so-called missing link that stands any chance of being recognised as a human ancestor. But as long ago as the 1950s, the eminent zoologist Sir Solly Zuckerman did a statistical analysis which concluded that Australopithecus was an ape-like creature and not a human-like creature. Yet Darwinists continue to believe that Australopithecines, like Lucy, are our ancestors. Darwinists have promised us a missing link, and so they've got to deliver, they've got to come up with one. Any missing link will do, it seems. Every so often a skeleton is found in Africa. Its discoverers describe it as being the missing link, the headlines come and go, and then later on that skeleton, those bones are reclassified either as human or as ape. And so far the missing link is still missing. Forbidden science sounds like a contradiction in terms, but what I mean by it is this. We're all familiar with the fact that Galileo was tried by the Inquisition and compelled to recant his belief that the Earth went round the sun. Now that's not what I mean by forbidden science, that's really human nature, because we all of us tend to reject the new. But the members of the Inquisition that tried Galileo refused to look through his telescope. They refused to look at the evidence that would have told them he was quite right. And that's what I mean by forbidden science. It's the refusal by some scientists to look at the facts in front of them and evaluate them. Yes. Well, of course, when you've constructed a very elaborate theory and you think you've already explained and you've told the public that you've already explained an important part of science, then naturally you're reluctant to have that overturned, to changed overnight. Scientists have made a big investment of their careers, their futures, I suppose even their pensions in believing certain theories, and when somebody comes along and tries to overturn that, then not surprisingly they're not very happy. Yes. It seems to be almost commonplace. Scientists are usually ridiculed when they make new discoveries. And this applies to people who we today regard as heroes of science, people like Michael Faraday, Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers. They were all absolutely ridiculed at the time that they made their discoveries. It was only later that they were regarded as heroes. Let me give you a really great example of scientific rejection. It's meteorites. In the 18th century, science decreed that meteorites didn't exist. They were completely unreasonable. Anton Lavoisier, who is regarded as the father of modern chemistry, said stones cannot fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky. And museums all over Europe were compelled to throw away their meteorites as superstitious relics of the past. As a result, you won't find any meteorite in any museum anywhere in the world that's older than about 1800, except one huge one that fell in Germany that was just too big to get rid of. It appears that science is such an authority that people are willing to have the evidence of their own eyes and ears overruled if the theory is accepted by enough scientists. One of the fundamental premises of Darwin's theory is that a species can, if it evolves long enough, turn into another species. Now, this central idea is contradicted by every single plant and animal breeding experiment of the last 500 years. Every animal and plant breeder knows that there is a limit to the extent to which an animal or a plant can be changed. Ultimately, the line becomes sterile, or it simply reverts to the original type from which you've selected. This has even been given a name. Ernst Mayr, professor of zoology at Harvard, called it genetic homeostasis. And that simply means that there is a barrier beyond which evolution cannot pass. And I find it extraordinary that the world's biologists continue to believe in the infinite plasticity of individuals when they know perfectly well that experiments show that it simply can't happen. Darwinism says animals can evolve indefinitely. Our experience of the real world is animals and plants have a definite limit beyond which they cannot go. A good question would be, what would it take for me to change my mind to become a Darwinist? Well, the answer's relatively easy. The whole Earth's surface is covered with sedimentary rocks, and in those rocks there are fossils. It ought to be possible to go to those rocks and to find a sequence of fossils, one species turning into another species, turning into another species. In fact, it ought to be possible for the kids at the local kindergarten to do this on an afternoon's nature study at the local quarry. But the world's greatest paleontologists, with the resources of the world's greatest universities at their disposal, have failed to do this, and they've been looking for more than 100 years. It is an extraordinary phenomenon that Darwinism is a theory which is universally accepted. It has no competitor in sight. It is taught in every school and university all over the world, and yet ultimately it has no foundation of fact or evidence to support it. It is a reasonable theory, but that's all it is, a reasonable theory. It seems to me that we've got to ask a lot more questions. We've got to be willing to be far more open. We've got to look at the facts, look at the anomalies that have been found, evaluate them, and if they tell us that Darwinism is unsupportable, then we've got to look for a new theory. One point I should make is that I'm not a professional scientist, I'm a science writer. But although I'm not a professional scientist, I have spent 20 years looking at the geology and the paleontology of Great Britain, and I've spent thousands of hours walking around the coast of Britain collecting fossils and mineral specimens. And one of the things that experience has taught me is that you cannot find a succession of fossils which demonstrate evolution. This was the start of my journey, if you like. I wanted to know, why couldn't I go out there and find evidence for evolution? What was I missing? Where was it? One of the things that I found in looking around the cliffs of Britain, one mystery that I discovered was, why was it that you could find fossil sea urchins in the chalk which were regular fossils? They'd been petrified, turned to stone. But you could also find the same sea urchin which was filled with flint. Flint is supposed to be a hard material. How did it get inside? Well, the idea is that at some stage it must have been soft and jelly-like. But how do you square that with taking millions of years for those rocks and those fossils to form? Doesn't that suggest that somehow the flint fossil was formed relatively rapidly? It was questions like this that made me examine a lot more closely the evidence I'd been offered for Darwinism and just accepted. What I found was that there are too many unanswered questions of this sort, too many mysteries, too many anomalies that have been just pushed to one side in the hope that sometime they'll be answered. I've spent 20 years now looking at the geology and the paleontology of Britain. I've collected thousands of fossils. I haven't found the answers that I'm looking for.